Thank you, Marcello. I would now prefer to have the panelists first address each other if there is some need, because it was planned as a panel discussion, but unfortunately you sit in a very dissociated way. So feel like sitting around the table, and if you wish so, address each other's comments first, and then we will open for us all.
And my assignment is to actually facilitate that discussion. So we'll get underway if there's those who wish to make comment, or else I can make an introduction for it, if you wish. Well, let me, if I may, Professor Bourguignon, just to get us started. I wish to, in the objective of this forum, Science for Solutions for People's Well-Being, there's an enormous contribution that's made by the European Research Council. Permit me to ask respectfully how you assess the performance of the Council in eliciting trust. That was the request of Bishop Jacqueline, the importance of trust, communicating the value of science to society. So if I may ask of your remarks or comments about that as we get underway with this kind of discussion, how you assess the performance of that task of eliciting trust about science to society as you measure what you do.
Question, which is totally legitimate. The responsibility of the Scientific Council is in particular to follow what the researchers who have been funded have been doing with their project. So one thing which the Scientific Council has introduced as soon as it could do it, that is as soon as the first projects were finished, was to assess the performance of these projects. And so we have now done, what does it mean? It means that projects last for 5 years. We wait 2 years until we have the full reports, the full publications, and then we have again an evaluation of what is done. What has been proposed for the evaluators has been 4 possible grades. One was 1A for breakthroughs, B for major scientific advance, C for incremental scientific advance, and D for more or less failure. And the outcome for the 3 years has been quite constantly the same: 20% breakthrough, 50% major scientific advance, and typically 1 to 4% failures. Actually, we were even a bit concerned of solo failures because we pushed the panels to really take risk, to really look for high-risk, high-gain projects. So it looked like if you really take risk, you should have more failures. Actually, since the projects are 5 years long, of course, it gives possibility to readjust in case you feel that you're not going to achieve. So that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is an effort we have been doing to monitor the overall portfolio of projects we have, which is a project which we call Science Behind the Project, which really gives a quite global description of all areas which are covered, which of course at the same time shows some areas which are not so well covered, because I repeat, it's strictly at the initiative of researchers. We don't set any priorities, so we just let people submit what they feel is the most appropriate for them. And so for that, we actually are requesting from the European Commission the possibility to really go a bit deeper into this analysis, because it's not our responsibility to do policy on this, but we want to take full advantage of what people have been doing. For the moment, this is not in the responsibility of the Scientific Council, but for the next framework program, this is one of the components, what we call agility. We felt that we should be given more responsibility on that. Now, concerning the relation with the public, that will be my final point, we have tried to do a lot. Actually, the European Research Council has a communication unit. We have been doing a number of events. I mentioned last year for the 10 years anniversary, 164 events. There are few institutions who have organized 154 events in 1 year. but we did it. But in particular, our presence on social media is quite important, and we're monitoring very closely the visibility of ERC, and in particular the project, not ERC as an institution, but really what the researchers are achieving in the press. And it's quite impressive. It varies from countries to country. I'm very sad that my own country is very low in the performance. I'm Frenchman, but many other countries are really remarkably performing with many articles in the press. I mean, really, I'm talking about thousands of articles in the press on the research which is done. Of course, we also wanted to have some more original things. So 2 projects which are just being finished. One of them has been a series of events in the museums all over Europe or other typical areas, and on various then topics chosen. One of them was about food, one was about smart cities, one was about the last one was, yes, about music. And so this was one activity. Another activity which has been extremely successful, which actually was a risk that we took, which is the support, and we finance some so-called, the program is called ERC Comics, which are web comics, which tell the stories of research projects, which have been fantastically successful up to the point that the artists who design the webcomics and the researchers continue to work together after the project is finished, which I felt was, personally I feel that artists and scientists should work more often together. So these are some components. Of course, in terms of the exact question you posed, the difficulty we have is this responsibility is not given to us. Our responsibility in terms of, for example, the money we spend is very specifically targeted towards financing research. And the other part, which has to do with, for example, relation directly with society, is always something we need to find some kind of a biased way of doing it. And so we managed to do the 2 projects I told you, but this is very limited in scale, in a sense, and this is what we have been doing.
Professor, what about religion in France? What about religion? And religion for climate change, religion for the nuclear menace?
Difficult for, you're talking about France specifically, or? Well, it's difficult for me to tell. Climate change, as you know, I mean, the main challenge about climate change is really the fact that no action will be of any value if it's not sustained over time. So you need, and this is something which is always difficult in the political environment, that you can always have what the government decides is turned down by the next one and so on, which in the end, the result which is not really what you hope. So in a sense, climate change is a real challenge to democracy, because without having a steady action, you cannot actually achieve things. Now, concerning really the question of nuclear, because you ask it, France has 2 components for nuclear. One, of course, is the nuclear weapons, which exist in France, but not only in France, also in the UK. But also the other component is a large part of the power, electricity, is produced in France by nuclear reactors. For the moment, I think it's about 72% of the production. And the program which has been approved is to go down to 50% by 2025. So this is the perspective. As you know, it has one side which is good because it's not producing CO2, which is a good side in terms of climate change. The other part is, of course, things which go with, and which is, of course, not easily accepted in some countries, more easily in some others, has to do with what do you do with the waste, which is, of course, the main issue of nuclear power plants. So this is the situation on this.
The President Macron have a special project to the challenge of climate change.
there are several components to that. One of them was, in particular, as soon as the US government decided that climate change didn't exist and was not a priority for the government, there was a specific program launched by President Macron to try and welcome in France researchers working in environment which would be willing from the US and would be willing to settle in France. And this program, I think, has been reasonably successful in the sense that I think there were a few hundreds applicants, and in the end, maybe 20 or 25 people who were hired, and not on a permanent basis, but on a reasonably long basis, and with the hope that it will be integrated into the research in France. As you know, I mean, the Paris Agreement has been a long effort by many, many different people, not just French people. It's true that the French diplomacy was very mobilized for this, but it was not the only one. It couldn't only be successful because many countries joined efforts to do that. And it's true that President Macron is still following this effort, which was started by his predecessor. But I don't think it should be a French issue. It's really, either it's a world issue or it's no issue. I mean, that's for me very clear.
Herr Schellgruber.
So thank you. Since unfortunately I have to leave in 10 or 15 minutes, allow me to make a few comments, because I think we had some very deep interventions, and it was actually about precisely faith and reason and how they go together, whether they contradict each other or whether they combine each other for the better of the world. So let me make a few comments. So first of all, I would like to congratulate the Archbishop of Uppsala, I think that's how you pronounce it, Uppsala, that this was an exquisite intervention, and I think your 5 Ps and your 3 in the end sort of guiding lights, that is something which we should deepen and discuss actually also tomorrow. So the second is on this curiosity-driven thing. So I mentioned this before. I think it's too simplistic to just say curiosity was given to us by whoever, and evolution say, and it is a constant of human nature. I mean, curiosity has emergent properties, clearly. Yeah? It has path dependence, it pops up from social discourse and many other things. So it's changing all the time, and if we think of Pasteur, for example, who was driven by curiosity, but also was driven by purposes. And I think, and that is my third comment, what Jürgen Mittelstraß said very well, I think, let's understand what is holding the world together, but let's also try to hold the world together with our scientific insights. I think there is no contradiction between these two things. The scientific method allows us to produce really deep insights, but that does not exclude that we contextualize those insights and then draw conclusions, actually, which will help to save the planet, for example, or will try to eliminate the deep gap between the rich and the poor. So why not doing both things at the same time? And if you look at the big heroes of science like Albert Einstein, they did both things, actually. Yeah? And the fourth thing is, unfortunately, my state secretary escaped. I had a public controversy with him recently. He was alluding to that, but now he has just escaped, so he will not face my response to that. But actually, let me cite another thing, which is not Jürgen Mittelstraß, but somebody who's almost matching him, Dante Alighieri. So he said in the Divina Commedia, the hottest place in hell is reserved for those who in times of deep moral crisis keep strictly neutral. And you know, we are in a phase of deep moral crisis, whether it's refugees, whether it's climate change, whether it's the poor people and the huge gap. So I don't think that the scientific community must be strictly neutral in every respect. So what he was alluding to is we are like a department store, you know? We are offering 5, 6, 7 options, and then the government is picking one of the menu options. But as Bourguignon just said quite rightly, I mean, when there is another government, and they pick a different option after 4 years, for example. So we need guiding principles will last longer than an election cycle, for example. And this is in our constitution, for example. It may be in the Bible. There are some guiding principles, and why shouldn't we make recommendations in line with the guiding principles of humanity and the Renaissance and all the principles that have created Western civilization, for example? Full stop.
Yeah, I have already 4 hands up. So Martin Rees was the first. Yes. Then Cardinal Carlin, then Mittelstrass, then you, and then you. So yes. Let's keep the sequence.
Yes. Well, Dr. Schnellhuber is right, of course, that scientists have ethical principles which they should enforce, but when they are talking about ethics or economics, they are just citizens with no special expertise. And that is why I think there was something in what Dr. Schutker said. But I do want to make the point that it is frustrating for experts who are advisors to politicians on issues like climate change, because politicians naturally have a focus on the short term and the local. And climate change, of course, is neither of those two things. But politicians respond to what's in the press and what's in their inboxes. And that's why what is crucially important is to maintain public interest and public pressure. And we've already had some mention of the importance of outreach in general, but it's crucially important here. And that's why the papal encyclical was so important, because that was a message which got through to literally 1 billion people. Whatever one thinks of the Catholic Church, no one can allow to deny its global reach, its concern about the world's poor, and its long-term vision, things that politicians don't have. And that's why it was so important. But we want to learn from that and think of other ways in which scientists can have a global impact on political opinion. Margaret Mead had a wonderful statement that it only takes a few determined people to change the world. In fact, nothing else ever has. And so it's very important that a few key figures can make a difference. That's been the case in all campaigns: anti-slavery, black power in the United States, gay rights, and all these things. And we need a similar campaign for climate change. And of course, there have been some campaigns and iconic images like the Apollo picture of the Earth, been important, the polar bear on the melting ice floe, and more recently, the albatross coughing up the plastic instead of food. Those images get through to the public, and if the public pressure is manifest to politicians, they will do something. In the last 2 years, the UK government, which it's hard to defend in other respects, has actually proposed legislation on abolishing non-reusable plastics. And that was influenced more than anything else by the TV program of the albatross and by a similar picture of a turtle. And so that's how we can influence. So I think this emphasizes the importance that we as scientists should accept that we are only citizens, but we have a special obligation to do outreach, to try and build up a strong body of opinion, which the politicians will then listen to.
Archbishop, you had the next.
Thank you. Since we were talking about both faith and science and climate change, I would like to make the point that actually the churches and other faith communities as well are, in a sense, uniquely posited to address the issue. And the way I think we should do is listen to science, ask what are the facts that are available, but also ask what are we not sure about yet? And how do we live with uncertainty? And of course, faith communities are used to living with some measure of uncertainty. We also are uniquely posed to ask and answer questions of how did we actually get here? Like, how did different views of nature, like nature as an organism or nature as a mechanism or nature as a warehouse or whatever, contribute to how we behave in relationship to nature. We are also inclined to have the long perspective. We actually speak about subspecie eternitatis, the eternity perspective, now not going as long as eternity, but we see the long perspectives that is more than politicians can do with their election periods, or that, for instance, companies do with the rhythm of their reporting systems. We also have the pastoral perspective. That is, we can also ask, what is that people do with the facts? Where is the fear coming from? Or where is the guilt coming from? We have been guilty of all these emissions, and what about those who suffer most but have contributed least? What about the unborn, etc.? And from our century-long experience of pastoral care, we should be in a position to address that constructively. And then also the big questions. Some years ago, there was some research being done when the question of genetically modified organisms was really discussed in public. And I think researchers in the UK studied like groups of ordinary people discussing this. And when journalists wrote about that, they said, oh, they're just being emotional about this. They're irrational. But what really happened was that the scientists spoke very clearly about just their piece, this, and the legal advisors spoke very distinctly from the point of view of law. But what people wanted to discuss was, what does it mean to be a human being in this? What is our right to do as human beings? And nobody was actually addressing these sort of inclusive questions. And that can actually be a threat to democracy, because democracy is dependent on that in important questions we actually can discuss and understand each other. But if we don't understand each other because when the big questions are asked, that is regarded to be emotional and irrational, that is a threat to democracy. And I think churches and faith communities should be posited and posed to bridge these gaps. And also to answer the question, who are we as human beings? And my answer would be, we are created co-creators. We are created, we are utterly dependent. Nobody has created themselves, but we are also co-creators. And then, as churches, we also can go to practice, of course. Locally, on the parish level, we have access to people, we have access to houses that we actually can shape and environmental friendly. We have access, speaking from the Church of Sweden, the Church of Sweden is the #1 owner of farmland in Sweden. That's also actually rented out. And the #5 steward of forest land, and we also have a substantial endowment. So already in 2009, we started to think about investing, divesting in a way that would be sustainable. And to our sort of surprise, we found that universities, foundations, corporations, both nationally and internationally, got interested when we could show that this was ethically sustainable according to our standards, and still we didn't make a loss. So being able to show it worked both ways was a sermon that actually worked. And I think this is some examples how faith communities have a unique position, and that position should not just be wasted. And it has to do with faith and science.
Thank you very much. Herr Mittelstraß, you are next on my list. It may be a bit random, then it's you.
Just a very...
then it's Bennett, and then it's Chu, and then it's you.
Okay. Just a very short response to Professor Schellenhuber. Curiosity-driven science. Perhaps we should distinguish between natural curiosity we share with cats, for example, and something like intelligent curiosity. So this distinction might help to stick with the concept of a curiosity-driven. And a short remark to Professor Rees. Indeed, ethics is always citizen ethics. It cannot be divided in an ethics for the society and ethics for the scientists or science. But the discussion on science ethics or ethics in science has still to learn this.
Fine. Next on my list is Boulevard L'Heure. Microphone.
Sorry. I've been hearing about distrust regarding science, or maybe I should say negative attitudes regarding science, which I would prefer yesterday and today. And I must confess to you, if I may use that word here, that I'm a little ill at ease, and I'm going to try, and I'm a little ill at ease because I feel the way this is handled is a little bit like declaring the people who are negative as heretics. And I think my proposal would be to sort of dissect this negativity to see what is reasonable and what is not. So I'll try to dissect it in three components, or in three parts. The first is what I would call the crass refusal of observation and clean logic as a way to generate physical truth. That is, of course, irredeemable, and if people want to say that and crassly refuse the soundest results and generally accepted results of science, we cannot but oppose them completely. A second way of being negative regarding science is to be negative regarding the scientist. That is, not to trust many scientists. Now, I'll tell you that, and I'm sure it's the same for many of us, all the time we do not trust our scientist colleagues, and we critically look at their results, and we feel lots of paper are nonsense. And you must also realize that the public is now reading in journals that are not specially anti-scientific, like The Economist in Britain, that a very large fraction of the papers that are published are false and not reproducible. So it's not a surprise that people should not automatically trust scientists. Also, in the field of social sciences, many people feel that scientists tend to have theses that are more based on their political opinions than on clean, objective research. So I think that distrust of scientists is healthy, and we share it, and we should try to clearly indicate to what I would call the negative people that one thing is not the same as the other. And then finally, there's a third component, which I think is very important, and that is, most of us believe that scientific progress brings human happiness. Now, in my country and in France, I'm pretty convinced that people are on the average less happy than they were 50 years ago. Now, you can tell them they should not be less happy, they are not right to be less happy, but if they are less happy, they're less happy. Huh? And people also generally feel that their society has been extremely shaped by scientific progress. And so if you're not happy and you feel your society is very strongly influenced by scientific progress, it's very difficult to accept the notion that scientific progress will bring human happiness. We scientists tend to believe this. I can tell you that a few years ago, a Belgian Nobel Prize in Physics told me that because of scientific progress, the world was getting incredibly more moral and virtuous. I was inclined to ask him if he had ever heard about the 20th century. But so I think these three doubtful or negative opinions should be very carefully distinguished. One is unacceptable, but the two others, there we should clearly avoid demonizing our opponents and engage in real discussion and maybe think about it ourselves. Because, and I will conclude with this, my personal impression is that science is irreversible, scientific knowledge, but that scientific knowledge tends to solve a problem and often create the next problem. If it wasn't for scientific progress, we probably would not be 7 billion on Earth right now. It probably would be 1 billion, and so on and so forth. So I will stop at this.
Thank you. Before I give the word to Jane Luchenko, a brief comment on this problem that objectively, there is also this recent book by Steven Pinker, even though I don't share all the statistics he has in there, there's objective evidence that many things got better over time. Literacy, food, poverty is less. Even the pollution in the great cities got much better than in Paris in the 18th century. And the poorest nowadays in Europe have been among the richest in former times. There is a psychological phenomenon which is brain research, but we know that we have the tendency, and this is a good tendency, to forget about the bad things and to remember the positive parts of our biography. We rewrite it all the time, and this is the reason why the older you get, the more you start to complain that everything has been better in former times. So there's a deep psychological reason for that. Also, we have the media that contribute to this false perception that everything got worse, because no news, good news is no news. Nobody writes ever that there was nobody murdered in Miami yesterday, because it's not worth a line. So, but this is just a comment, and Jane, I would like to give the word to you, because you were the one who also gave us a little bit of optimism after all in your presentation.
Thank you for the opportunity to respond. I think that in posing your question, you have rightly focused on some of the complexities of trust in science and trust in scientists, and those are different things. So I think that's a really excellent question. I believe that the Archbishop, in her very eloquent and wise remarks, has touched on some of the elements of this as well. But to what both of you have said, I would add a little more complexity just to sort of flesh this out. I think there's been a fair amount of, or there has been social science research that sheds some light on this question. And some of that finds that when non-scientists listen to many scientists talk, they don't understand a lot of the technical words. And many people, when they don't understand something, they don't trust it, and they don't like it because they feel inferior. And so this, I think, points to the importance of at least a number of scientists learning to be what I call bilingual, speaking the language of science, but being able to also speak the language of lay people and use non-technical, non-threatening terms to make science more accessible. That's not an easy thing to do, and it's not just a question of media training, because it's not just how to talk before a camera, it's how to translate really complicated science into something that's understandable but still accurate, and we all know how difficult that is. So that's one additional dimension. Another social scientist, Suzanne Fiske, has analyzed people's non-scientist perceptions about scientists and ranked them in two dimensions. One dimension, the x-axis that she uses is competence, and so she's actually looked at people's attitudes, not just about scientists, but about lots of different professions, and ranked them along the axis of competence and warmth. And in her research, for someone to be trustworthy, they have to be both competent and warm. And in most people's perceptions of scientists is that they're highly competent, but they're very cold. And therefore, they aren't necessarily trustworthy. And so a lot of the communications training for scientists can emphasize how to be perceived as being warmer, being more accessible, being human, not just a nerdy scientist, while still being competent. So I think that fleshes it out a little bit. The third complexity is that sometimes people will trust some science, but not other science. And when they trust some science, it's often because it is consistent with their worldviews or their beliefs, but they don't trust other science because it conflicts with their beliefs. And this is true for evolution, for example. If it conflicts with their personal beliefs, then they reject the science. So it's even more complex than the things that you highlighted. The point that I would raise, and I was going to pose to any of the panelists, was what are the ways that we can enhance trust in science, in addition to some of the things that have already been mentioned? And nobody's really talked about citizen science yet. But citizen science as a way of engaging people in either taking data or analyzing data or understanding it can be a useful path. It's more accessible for some kinds of science than others, for sure. But I think that it is increasingly important as a tool in our toolbox for enhancing public trust in science where it's appropriate. So I would just put citizen science on the table.
Does anybody of the panel want to answer directly to this question? Otherwise, it's Dr. Bennett who is next on my list. So if the panel doesn't want to answer, maybe you have something.
Well, if not, let me go back to what Terry was saying, but a bit more aggressively by quoting Richard Feynman, who is always good for a bon mot when he says that science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. So this would be a question over to Reverend Jekylin, whether when she says that Sweden has a highest level of trust in scientific experts, would you agree or not agree with Richard Feynman that that means that Sweden is the least scientific population? And if you say that the Greens are even more trusting, that they're even less scientific? And this is a subversive way of making a general point, and that is that when we present as scientists to the public this notion that we are the purveyors of the new truth, having maybe displaced religion, that they should be worried about trusting us, that's a dangerous way to go. Now, I a couple years back gave a lecture to a bunch of creationists in the Gainesville community. Now, these are creationists, but they're not fools. And so when you say to them, we're scientists, trust us, they're smart enough to realize that all we're doing is the same thing as what their priest says in their local creation. Now, they choose to believe the creation science. But it seems to me that we need, as scientists, to not say that trust is an important part of science, that in fact, and back to quoting Feynman again, that religion is the culture of faith, science is the culture of doubt. And if you thought that the science was certain, well, that's just an error on your part. That's Feynman. What's that? Well, if you thought that science was certain, this is Feynman, well, that's just an error on your part.
Yeah. Well, these are interesting thoughts. First, about the complexities, I agree with what you said, and I think what you said, Jane, actually resonates well with the bit of research I quoted and the interpretation. I think you fleshed it out very nicely. Thank you. Whether trust, I mean, we shouldn't simplify, of course, the concept of trust and reduce it to some sort of fuzzy sort of feeling. There are a lot of ingredients in trust. And I mean, sometimes it's said, oh, the virtue of scientists is there's nothing they love more than to be proved wrong. And I think that's a lovely theory. And since scientists are human beings as well, they don't always love to be proved wrong. But again, being proved wrong, of course, opens up for new questions, for new solutions. So doubt is, of course, an important ingredient in science, but it is in faith as well. There is no true faith that doesn't have experience with doubt. So I don't think we should, Feynman is not quite right on that. We shouldn't construct that kind of contradiction between science and faith.
Dr. Shu, please.
Just a small correction of what you just said. Nothing will please scientists more than proving someone else wrong. But I'm going to tell you about some personal experiences in dealing with some of the other public that perhaps this council doesn't brush against. And it goes to many of the comments, especially to Georg Schulte's comment about, and your comment about not demonizing people who you disagree with. So several anecdotes. One is when I talk to people in the automobile industry, I was at a dinner table with very proud German BMW, Audi, Mercedes internal combustion engineers who make some of the best engines in the world. And they thought that all this hyperbola on EVs, battery-operated vehicles, this is terrible. We make really wonderful things. What are you telling it? And so Rosa, they were telling me, you're telling me that the last 20 or 30 years of my life, I didn't do good for society? The people in the oil and gas industry say this. For the last 100 years of oil and gas, we gave the world energy. Coal, for the last 250 years, we gave the world energy, which actually lifted a large fraction of society out of poverty. And now all of a sudden you're saying we're evil. And so this does not play well. But despite that, I also have I can't help but feeling that, and I tried to suppress it, but I'm no good at it because I'm a nerdy scientist, that I do think that the concern about climate change and what do we do about all the things that are going to result from it, whether it's bad, really bad, or catastrophic, is ultimately a moral issue in my mind. But if you say it's a moral issue, then all of a sudden you've closed off lots of people. Just my personal perception of then all of a sudden you're saying I'm a bad person. I'm not a bad person, so I'm not going to listen to you anymore. So how one gets this across is a dilemma for me. Maybe the collective wisdom in this room can add to that. But one final thing, and that has to do with the timescales. The timescales of politics are very different from the timescales we're talking about. Also very different than the timescale, let's say, of the Catholic Church. That's a 2,000-year timescale, where perhaps moral rudder and compass shouldn't be going from yearly elections or every fourth year. And so one of the things, if you look at the cultures and institutions that give you this long time scale, that ultimately would have to be some sort of rudder, moral, ethical rudder, because we're facing a democracy which is swayed by rapid changes in Facebook manipulations and all these other things. And so, but again, how do you communicate what is happening, and that scientists may not be trusted, but the process of science, of trying to get closer to the truth and testing each other is perhaps, it's actually a very good process. And that thing
is ultimately, should be trusted more if people understood more. But again, this is a communication. So I throw it open to the audience here. How do you actually communicate these values to the public?
Yeah, the question is there a better antidote than the scientific approach to the solution of problems for false beliefs? Do we have something else? Are our belief systems better? But you are the next anyway on the list, so fine.
Let's look at the world as it is right now. The IPCC just came out with a report stating that we were going to lose it completely on climate change if we didn't get very serious within the next 10 years. Nobody has stated any goals that would get us there, and none have really been adopted by countries around the world. I think, remember that there are 7.6 billion people in the world, 1.3 billion in industrialized countries, 1.4 billion in China, and 5 billion in the rest. We're adding in the next 30 years at the rate of 220,000 a day, an additional 2.3 billion people. How many of those people and how many of those governments are going to be convinced by painstaking scientific arguments that they should take steps to correct the world and make it a sound place before the next 10 years are over? Within the next 2 or 3 generations, we're poised to lose perhaps 10, perhaps 20% of all life on Earth, which is what sustains us. I think in a way, when we talk about science exclusively and how can we make it better and communicate it better, we certainly need to do that, but the number of scientists in the world who are in a position to really bring about changes on the magnitude that we need is extraordinarily limited, and many countries have no scientific presence at all. I think it's a kind of hubris for us to assume that we can eventually, it's scientific way, that we can eventually logically talk everyone into changing their ways and adopting policies that will make the world sustainable. Steven Pinker is a fool who's catering to people's desire to think that everything's lovely. If everything's lovely, why are we going to lose it to climate change in the next 10 years, and why are we going to lose 10%, 20% of the world's species in the next 2 generations? The only thing that I know that can overcome this situation, well, one more point, consider how officials are elected in so-called democratic countries. They're elected on the basis of their, largely, if you want to put it in the hardest way, for their willingness either pretend that everything is going to be all right, to foster greed of the people who are voting for them. Everything's not only going to be all right, but you can use as much money as you want in the near future because we're going to get it for you. And you end up with kind of a Juan Perón-like Evita Perón view of the world in which money is just going to be handed out to everybody because the government is sensible and understands that everything's inexhaustible if each of us would just be as greedy as we can. We cannot, on this single planet, live at the standard that we live in Europe and the United States. As I mentioned the other day, 8 people have as much wealth as the 3.6 billion poorest people in the world, and nothing is really happening. The only thing that I think that can overcome this is a feeling of care and love for one another. We've got to care and love the people that live in our own communities, and we've got to care and love the other 7 billion people in the world who aren't as fortunate as we are. We can go on talking to ourselves forever, but talking to ourselves forever, I don't think can possibly get us to the goals that we need to get to while there's still time to do it. I hope that we would take seriously the bishop's comments and many other comments that have been made here about the need for care, understanding, love, and morality for one another, to overcome the greed, the selfishness, and the idea of short-term gain that so infuses all of our elected officials everywhere, pretty much, if you want to be somewhat cynical about it. And this ought to be an ideal setting to get on with the real solutions and while trying to present science as clearly as we can and as widely as we can, for heaven's sakes, let's stop pretending that we're going to be able to convince everybody to vote in governments and all that are going to act on those principles. In the most advanced scientific countries in the world right now, it isn't happening. It isn't likely to happen. It isn't predicted. Why do we think we can change the whole world, and what's going to be the mechanism for that?
Thank you. I remember a theory that says if 20% of a population agree and organize well, they can tip the majority. It isn't, you don't have to have the majority to begin with.
Well,
20% of well-organized people are enough. But I shouldn't get myself into the discussion. I have two more hands up, and then I think we should slowly wrap up and have a little bit of sip of fresh air before we go for dinner. So the next is Antonio.
I think we must introduce in this discussion education. Science education is needed, and we should discuss that. Of course, Yves Carré is here, Pierre Lénin, and has organized this fantastic foundation on La Malaparte in France, and there's so many. But science education can start very, very early in life. Children love science when they can construct science, not only to hear about science. And this is a great change. Tomorrow I will try to introduce this idea, but there's a lot, I would say, a lot of hope about the way that we are changing the system in learning and teaching science. And this can help a lot for everything that we are discussing here. This is a point.
Thank you. No? So then the list is closed, unless there is some urgent final remark, wrapping up everything. I would like to close this session. Thank very much all the discussants, the contributions, and wish you a nice and calm evening.